Welcome. In this final video on the French Revolution, we will look at the fall of Napoleon, his three big mistakes, and the Congress of Vienna that wraps up the French Revolution and the Napoleonic Wars. So last time I foreshadowed if Napoleon had risen to such power, whereby during his rule, say by 1812, he had expanded France to include the Low Countries, large chunks of Italy and Illyria, and a big chunk of Switzerland. He had an alliance with big chunks of Italy, Germany, Spain, and the Grand Duchy of Warsaw. He'd put his own brother on the throne of Spain. And he had deals with Russia and Prussia and Austria. He, in 1812, would go against Russia, and then other allies would turn on him. And he had been at war with Britain for years. But if he had merely consolidated his reign and attempted harder to avoid future wars, there are those who think he would not have ended up like this, losing Napoleon here at Waterloo, or here after having been defeated and exiled. So what was it? Well, he put his brother on the throne of Spain, but for a variety of reasons. One of the chief among those reasons was the popularity of devout Catholics in Spain who resented the implementation of French revolutionary ideas about the church. But they also, in general, resented the loss of their monarch and the imposition of French government in other ways. But so Napoleon, with Napoleon's help, the Bonapartes had suppressed the Spanish. But the Spanish resorted to guerrilla, or little war, whereby with hit-and-run tactics, they actually caused Napoleon to lose nearly 300,000 men over the course of a number of years, almost a decade, of trying to suppress rebellions in Spain. And this resulted in a massive drain of manpower and resources that could have been better spent otherwise. And so by pursuing this war on the Iberian Peninsula in Spain, Napoleon suffered a major defeat. Next, his continental system. He was adamant to defeat Britain, but since the Battle of Trafalgar had destroyed the combined French and Spanish fleet, he was looking for an economic way to simply strangle the British and choke them off. And so he made all the countries under his power and allied with him, and whose armies he had beaten. He forced them to sign an agreement basically where the continent of Europe would have its own continental trade system, where they would restrict trade with Britain, but Britain just retaliated and passed its own orders in council, and they would blockade European ports that were obeying Napoleon's orders. But he would require all the European countries to adhere to his rules. It was not very popular, and many of the countries, most famously Russia, violated it and simply traded with Britain. Remember that the Industrial Revolution is just taking off, and that Britain is the home of the Industrial Revolution. Remember that Britain has its powerful navy, and its overseas empire controls India and big chunks of Africa, and that refusing to trade with Britain and the British Empire was a major financial hit to many countries. And so many countries secretly disobeyed Napoleon, and had Napoleon simply permitted trade with Britain to continue as normal, he may have driven other countries to have more anger at Britain rather than at him. And so, having defeated countries militarily, he continued to have these other countries hate his rule because of the trade restrictions imposed by the continental system. But the straw that broke the camel's back was Napoleon's invasion of Russia in 1812. When Russia refused to adhere to the rules of the continental system and stopped trading with Britain, he launched a massive invasion with a 500,000-man Grand Army that launched and plunged its way into Russia. And they were very successful. But the Tsar, the King of Russia, adopted a scorched earth policy where they would burn their own country, houses and villages and schools and buildings and food and fields and animals, and slaughter it so that Napoleon's army could get no nourishment and no supply replenishment by capturing things in Russia. They fight a Battle of Borodino near Moscow, which then Napoleon enters, but they burn much of their own capital, and Moscow is a wreck, and the Russians simply continue to fight on. But by this time, the Russian winter has set in terribly, and with Russia having its army having been beaten, I believe Petersburg was still the capital, but Moscow, one of its important cities, having been captured, and heavily burned, the Russians still wouldn't surrender. And his army was dwindling. It was cold. They were short on food. And they began this terrible retreat. And of the 500,000 men that went with him, only 10,000 survived, returned to France, which then triggers a fourth coalition to form, a series of countries such as Prussia and Russia and Britain form a new coalition or alliance against him. And Napoleon races back to France, raises a new huge army, and fights the Battle of Leipzig, also called the Battle of Nations, because so many different countries, different nations were represented in fighting against Napoleon. But now Napoleon has lost all of his battle-hardened troops and junior officers and higher-ranking officers who had been so successful for him before that his new recruits were very ineffective and is unable to execute one of his famous battle maneuvers that saves his bacon and pulls off the victory, and he is defeated. He surrenders and is exiled to the island of Elba off the coast of Italy, at which point the victorious Allies convened the Congress of Vienna, a peace treaty that would imitate the 1648 Peace of Westphalia as a way to establish a new balance of power for the 1800s and put Europe back together again. But as it is convening, Napoleon returns. He was technically just exiled, and they gave him this honorific title but no power, but he was kind of under a very weak house arrest, and he comes back. And the French people are overjoyed, and he raises another huge army. And the Allies, notably under Prussia and Britain, send an army to fight Napoleon again. And technically it's in Belgium, but at the Battle of Waterloo in 1815, the British Duke of Wellington famously outmaneuvers and defeats Napoleon, who again, with his brand new recruits, has an ineffective army and is defeated once and for all. Now he is no longer allowed to go to Elba, which is still pretty close to Europe, but rather is sent to St. Helena off the coast of South America, way off the coast of South America, and imprisoned, where not that many years later he dies. Many people think of stomach cancer. Some people think he was poisoned, but as a result he dies in a prison on an island many hundreds of miles away from Europe after having been defeated again. So what does the Congress of Vienna do? Well, we saw, and so here's a very defeated Napoleon at Waterloo, and afterwards as they're deciding what to do with him. They're going to dismantle France, but not too much. The Congress of Vienna has many territorial adjustments to make that we will talk about. All the great powers are represented, even France. They don't prohibit France from sending people, even though the French Revolution and the Napoleonic Wars are heavily France's blame to take. They allow them to be there to have a voice, even though a quiet one, in some of the proceedings. The architect and chief mastermind of the Congress was Austrian Foreign Minister Clemens von Metternich, and he had several goals, many of which were achieved at this Congress. The goal was to contain rather than simply to punish France. So you look at France having had many conquests here, they would strip many of that away and create some buffer states. They would beef up the Kingdom of Piedmont, Sardinia by adding territory here on the Italian mainland. They would strengthen the country of the Netherlands, give Switzerland key land. They allowed the Holy Roman Empire to remain dead and gone, and instead this German confederation that still kind of included Austria, but it's got this German dualism of a hefty Austria and a hefty Prussia that have lands both in and outside of Germany. But then instead of 300, this light green contains 37 other German countries. You have Austria, you have Prussia, and then 37 other smaller German states that exist in there, where there once had been 300, and many more even before that. So that's one of the major, some of the major territorial adjustments there. And they're looking for a balance of power. They want to avoid universal monarchy, where one power has all of the power. For example, for a long time, the Holy Roman Emperor under the Habsburgs, where they controlled much of Germany, the Austrian Empire, parts of Italy, Spain, Naples, part of the Netherlands, and all of the conquests of Spain in the New World. That was all the empire of Charles V, for example. He was sort of a universal monarch. And then going back, you go back to Charlemagne or the actual Roman empires much further back. But in the era of Louis XIV, the absolute monarch of France, France was super powerful and was making aspirations to being the universal monarch of Europe. And then under the French Revolution and Napoleon, they came very close to doing it. And so rather than having any one power that could threaten all the others, they sought this balance of power at the Congress of Vienna. No universal monarchy. They create the buffer states we already talked about, and they want to turn back the hands of time and undo the revolution. But they can't quite put Humpty Dumpty back together again. It's like you're trying to break an egg on accident, and you're going to say, oh, give me some duct tape. I'm going to put that egg back together. You can't quite do it. You can't put the genie back in the bottle. You can't put the egg back together. You can't totally undo the ideas that the French Revolution had unleashed on Europe and the world. But they primarily used the principle of legitimacy to take old rulers and put them back into power. So, for example, the son of Louis XVI, Louis XVII, had actually died in prison. So they pick his son, Louis XVIII, to be the next king of France. But again, even though their main principle is legitimacy, remember that shame of the princes. Many of the princes had consented to this, where they agreed to demolish the Holy Roman Empire, and the 250 or so smaller German states were effectively wiped off the map. And a couple of concluding things. Remember that Austria, Russia, and Prussia form the Holy Alliance. And it's interesting because the Protestant country Prussia, the Catholic Austrians, and the Eastern Orthodox Russians form sort of a Christian alliance. Again, putting to rest that idea that religious war is over, but as three Christian kings of slightly different Christian faith, they would unite with one another against the more godless ideas of the French Revolution and their Caesaro-papism and takeover of the Catholic Church as had been accomplished in France. And finally, Metternich orchestrated this series of alliances that he called the Concert of Europe. Like in a concert, no one instrument per se outshines all the others. They need to be working in concert. They need to be working together in harmony. That the idea that the countries of Europe should work together. And there is kind of this alliance among all of the kings and princes and nobility of Europe that really they don't pose as much of a threat to each other as a revolution in their own country poses to them. They look around through a lot of European history, and it's been a long, long time since kings were killed on the battlefield or were arrested and executed by their enemies. You look at kings, and the bigger threat to them were revolutionaries. You look at the English Civil War, you look at the French Revolution, and you look at many other examples that we haven't studied in this class, and kings had more to fear directly to their own person. They had more to fear from their own people than they did from other countries. And so there was this sort of concert or alliance among all the countries that if a violent revolution broke out, that other countries would rally to defend that king. Even if that king was a historical enemy, they would work to restore them to power. And that results in this concert of Europe, the Congress of Vienna, that puts Europe back together again, and will not see one of the five great powers of Europe go to war with each other until the Crimean War in 1853, and will not see much revolution until 1830 and a big explosion of revolutions in 1848, which we will talk about in a future unit next time. Thanks for watching.